Hey everyone, so I come to you with what I hope will be the first in a mini-series of videos that I want to post on my channel about the classics of Greece and Rome. And if you've watched my channel for any length of time, you've probably discerned that I'm quite a big fan of the classics of Greece and Rome, but if you're new, or if I haven't made it clear, I'm a big fan of the classics of Greece and Rome. I've read many of the classics of Greece and Rome throughout the years of my reading life, and I think I can now safely sort of call myself a bit of an aficionado, which is not to say that I am the most well-read person in the classics of Greece and Rome. I'm not the most well-read person in the classics on BookTube. I should say that too. But I have read quite a good number, and there's quite a good number that I want to read. And so I thought that I would start this little sort of mini-series of videos just sort of enthusing about the classics of Greece and Rome. I think I'm gonna do some videos where I like rank some of my favorite classics of Greece and Rome of different genres, maybe talk about some of my favorite poems from the ancient world, and other things. And yeah, so it's just gonna be a series of videos talking about different aspects of the classics of Greece and Rome, and I am really excited about it. And I thought that I would start off by just talking about what got me into the classics of Greece and Rome. It's not like a super interesting story, but I thought that it might be enjoyable. So when I was about 22, thereabouts, 21, 22, I had been a devoted reader for about a year and a half, maybe just on 2 years, because I didn't become a devoted reader till I was about 21, and I felt like I had to sort of make up for a lot of lost time. I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder, so to speak, and I felt like I needed to become well-read. You know, I needed to read Homer and Shakespeare and all these things. And so in my quest to do that, I decided to just sort of start at the beginning, and I just read the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Odyssey I had read in high school, but I reread it. And then I moved on to Virgil's Aeneid and Ovid's Metamorphoses, and those four books in particular just bowled me over. I just loved them. Maybe not Virgil so much, but there are parts of Virgil that are great. But Ovid and Homer were just huge for me. They just had incredibly moving, powerful human stories that were immediately accessible to me, despite the fact that they're from thousands of years ago. And so I just decided that I was going to keep reading books from that era, and I moved on to the dramatists and to the philosophers. I had already read a little bit of Plato, but I hadn't read Plato because I was interested in the classics. I was just interested in philosophy at one point. And yeah, and I've gotten interested in the ancient historians lately as well. So it's just kind of continued from there. And, you know, it's one of those great hobbies or interests that, you know, you don't really have to work at that much. You're just so into it that it just comes naturally. You know, I just reached for these books because they were interesting, not because I said, oh, well, I need to read, you know, the commentaries on the Gallic War, or you know, I need to read Thucydides or something. I just was interested in the books, and then by sort of a happy accident, I found myself, you know, reasonably well-read. Again, not the most well-read, but yeah, so that's how I got into the classics of Greece and Rome, kind of by accident, honestly. Yeah, so I thought I would talk about my collection of the classics of Greece and Rome in this first video, and just the books that are classics of Greece and Rome that I own. And I'm talking about both ones that I have read and those I own and haven't read. And I thought that I would just go through them just to show them off if you find that interesting. And I thought that for the ones that I have read, I would give like little one-sentence, you know, reviews, mini reviews, and then the others that I haven't read, I'll just sort of hold them up and tell you a little bit about them and be on my merry way. But yeah, so I thought that I would do that for the first video. And by the way, I should say, I don't know whether this is going to be like a weekly video series or a monthly video series or like once every other week kind of thing. But yeah, anyway, expect to see more videos specifically focusing on the classics of Greece and Rome from me. But anyway, without further ado, I will start talking about the books. One thing you will notice is that there are a lot of books in this category where I own a couple of copies. The first one being Homer's Iliad. So this is the Robert Fitzgerald translation with a cover that I really like, that kind of modernist, minimalist painting. And then this is a lovely Easton Press edition of the Alexander Pope translation. This one I have read this one, I haven't yet. The Iliad is one of the most powerful books I've read. I just love it. It's one of my favorite books of all time. Definitely worth the read. And then, of course, the other major work by Homer is the Odyssey. And this is, again, the Robert Fitzgerald translation. This copy is a bit more battered than the other one, but still a lovely cover. And then this is the more recent Emily Wilson translation, which is good. It has a great introduction. The translation itself is, serviceable and decent, but the introduction is, the very long introduction that she writes is excellent. And the Odyssey is a great adventure story. I really enjoy it. It's more immediately enjoyable as a story than the Iliad, but I think the Iliad ultimately offers more narrative rewards, if that makes sense. Next, we have the big dramatists of ancient Greece. So first up is Sophocles, and this. So I have 2 copies of his Theban trilogy or Oedipus trilogy, whichever you want to call it. Technically, these plays were not actually written as a trilogy. They were just 3 plays that Sophocles happened to write on the theme of the Oedipus myth that get lumped together as a trilogy these days. But anyway, this is a Penguin classic. This is an older translation. It doesn't do much, but I got this from my grandpa, so I sort of keep it for sentimental reasons. And then I have a Penguin of Electra and other plays. I mean, Oedipus, the Oedipus cycle, what can I say that hasn't already been said? It's, again, like with the Iliad, it's worth the read. It's just as interesting and fascinating and surprising as it was, I'm sure, in the day when it debuted. And then these are Sophocles' other plays, all of which I've read once but don't have strong memories of, so don't feel like I can say much. Alright, then Euripides. This is 10 plays. This is a Signet classic with translations by Paul Roach. And Euripides is my favorite playwright from the ancient world. Certainly one of my favorite writers. I can't say on the fly whether he is my absolute favorite writer of the ancient world, but he would probably be in that conversation if I were thinking of that. Just the psychological insight that he has and how modern he is just make him endlessly fascinating to me. He's just brilliant. I love him. And then the comic playwright Aristophanes. This is his complete plays, the plays that survive. There are only 11 that survive. I've only read the Lysistrata. Haven't read the other 10. I don't really get why people say that, Aristophanes' humor doesn't age well, because I think that the Lysistrata is just a hoot. It's just absolutely hilarious. It's just great. And so I need to read more of that, though. And then lastly, we of course have Aeschylus, and so this is the Oresteia in another Easton Press edition. And this, I believe, is the Robert Fagles translation. Lovely copy. And like with the Oedipus cycle, what can I say that hasn't already been said? It's just a fascinating work of literature and so influential. If you've read Hamlet and Crime and Punishment in particular, but many other works as well, you will see the influence that this book has had on literature. And then, of course, there's the Persians and other plays. Like with the other Sophocles plays, I've only read all of these once, so I don't have strong impressions of them, but the Persians I remember really liking. Now we're moving into some philosophers. This is a divisive genre, but this first up here is a Pre-Socratic Reader. This is edited by Patricia Curd, and has translations by Richard McKirahan and Patricia Curd. And the Pre-Socratics are really interesting. They had some fascinating but kind of kooky ideas, and it's hard to make much sense of them because their work all survives in fragments, either in manuscripts that have been ruined or their manuscripts doesn't even survive. Their work, the only quotations that we have from them are pieces of their work that were quoted by later writers, and I find them very interesting, but again, it's hard to get a lot out of them just because there's so little from them, but they are interesting to read. And then, of course, Plato is the big one. So this is the Republic. So this is a kind of nice edition. This is translated with notes and an interpretive essay by Alan Bloom. And so it's a big book. I haven't actually read this translation and this edition yet. I haven't read the big interpretive essay that's in here, but I've read The Republic twice in a different translation, and I really think it is a fascinating book. It's absolutely worth the read. It is long, but Plato is, unlike a philosopher I'm going to talk about in a minute, pretty easy to read. He he's not dry in the way that the said philosopher who's coming up is. He writes his books in the form of dialogues, which makes them kind of engaging, but the Republic, I think, is just endlessly thought-provoking and fascinating. So yeah, and then this is a collection of his shorter dialogues. A lot of these are also very interesting. I haven't actually read this entire thing, but I've read probably more than half of it. And then here's just the Symposium on its own, which I don't have strong memories of, and I don't remember liking particularly, but yeah. Then we have that other philosopher that I mentioned. This is Aristotle. This is just a flimsy old Dover thrift edition of the Poetics. I only keep it because I annotated this one, and I like to have my annotations. And then we have the Basic Works of Aristotle, which is a lovely edition, and this includes, like, everything that you probably would ever want to read by Aristotle, you know, the Nicomachean Ethics, the Poetics, you know, the Metaphysics, De Anima, Physics, etc. Aristotle is horrible. Yeah, he's horrible to read. He's just terrible. He's just incredibly dull. You know, the ideas that he explains that need a lot of explaining, he usually just glosses over really quickly, and then the ideas that are just glaringly obvious what they are, he feels the need to dissect as though they were in need of in-depth explanation, and he's just infuriating to read for me. I've only read the Poetics and the Nicomachean Ethics. The Poetics is okay because it's very short, so, you know, it has the same kind of bad writing, but because it's so short, you can kind of tolerate it. Alright, but moving on from philosophy, we now move into some sort of historians, or, well, actually, before the historians, I have one more, not really work of philosophy, but a work of literary criticism. This is On the Sublime by Longinus, or Longinus, quote-unquote, because we don't know who the author is, but this is just about the sublime in literature, and it's a really accessible piece of literary criticism, and it did set the stage for a lot of, like, the way we think of literature, so it is a really interesting and easy read. It's very short. Alright, now historians. So obviously we have the two big ones. We have Herodotus in this Oxford World's Classics edition, translated by Robin Waterfield, and then we have Thucydides, The History of the Peloponnesian War, with a translation by Richard Crawley, which has been revised by Donald Latner. Herodotus, I have actually attempted to read in the past. I read about 3/5 of this a few years ago and really enjoyed what I read. He is a great storyteller. Yeah, it's not dry at all. If you think that this ancient history is going to be dry, this is not dry. I cannot say the same for Thucydides. Thucydides is a chore to read. He is just not a good writer. And this is a really interesting book because it's a primary source on the Peloponnesian War, and because of the sort of thinking that Thucydides does about history and the motives for the war and such, but it's just not pleasurable reading at all. But this next one is one that I haven't read. This is The Rise of the Roman Empire by Polybius, and Polybius was a Greek writer, but he was writing in the Roman era, and he wrote this history of the rise of the Roman Empire. Haven't read this one yet, but I've heard good things. And then a really good writer is Plutarch. This is his complete parallel lives in 2 volumes, and this is a basically a gigantic work where he writes a series of very short biographies of significant men. And what he does is he pairs the lives with each other. So he'll have, you know, 2 lives that he sees as somehow thematically related. So, like, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar were a pair, and you can probably see the connection there. And that's why it's called Parallel Lives, and it's huge. I think that there's something like 50 lives in it. And I think I've read about 1/3 of this work, between several of the different lives, but eventually I would like to read the whole thing. It is really good. Plutarch is one of my favorite ancient writers. He's just really readable, a really important primary source on a lot of the people he writes about. Yeah, a really good read. And then for the Greeks, we round things out with some lyric poetry. So this first one is Hisod and Theognus. Hesiod wrote the Theogony, which is kind of an account of the Greek creation myth and the sort of overthrow of Cronus by Zeus. If you're familiar with that story, it's an epic poem about that. And this also has the Works and Days, which is all about farming, and it's the Theogony I really like. The Works and Days is a bit dull. And then Theognus was a lyric poet, and I did not care for his poetry. Then we have a really good lyric poet. This is Pindar, who is excellent. He wrote these lyric poems as sort of a lot of them as like celebrations for victories by athletes in sporting events like the Olympics, but he sort of always goes beyond that subject matter to sort of blow out into profundity, and yeah, they're really beautiful poems. And then Theocritus, the Idylls. I mostly turned to reading Theocritus because he had a big influence on John Milton, but I don't care too much for what I've read of these. I've read about half of this. It's okay. I think translating lyric poetry is very difficult, and that's going to become a bigger theme when I talk about the Roman writers. And then the last Greek lyric poet is one I really like. This is Sappho. Sappho is one of the only women from whom we have like a substantial body of work, and even of the work that she did write, we don't have that much. Most of what we have is fragments. This is a translation by Anne Carson. I definitely recommend this one. Anne Carson is a great poet in her own right, and what's cool about this one too is it has the Greek on one side and the English on the other, so that's a really good translation. This one is a bit more pedestrian. It's by Willis Barnstone, I believe. Yeah, Willis Barnstone. It's a bit more pedestrian, but it's still serviceable. Alright, now we move on to the Romans. And I thought that I would start with the biggies, with the epic poets. And that means that I get to talk about my lovely box set that I have. This is the Library of Latin Literature. And it has 4 works in it. It has Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is one of my favorite books. It might be my favorite book from ancient Rome. I'd have to think about that a bit more, but I think it might be my favorite book from ancient Rome. It has the Satires of Juvenal, which I haven't read. Virgil's Aeneid, which is interesting and obviously influential, but not as fun to read as Ovid's Metamorphoses, let's put it lightly like that. And then it has The Art of Love by Ovid. And The Art of Love in this... I'm actually currently reading The Art of Love, and in this, it's actually not... He had a work called the Ars Amatoria, which is, Latin for the Art of Love. But this edition of the Art of Love includes his Amores, which are a series of short love poems that he wrote, and also some other various works that don't survive in their complete forms in it. So it's a bit of a collection of Ovid's shorter work. And yeah, this is a great box set. It's another book I got from my grandpa, and yeah, I cherish it. The translations are all by Rolfe Humphreys, and I have mostly liked them, so yeah. And then my second copy of Ovid, because that's how much I like him. This is the Horace Gregory translation. This is a really good translation. If you're going to read a copy of, or if you're going to read Ovid's Metamorphoses, I definitely recommend this translation, because, yeah, it also has a great introduction and an afterword, so, yeah. And then some other epic poets who are not quite as well known. Well, okay, the first one is pretty well known. This is Lucretius on the Nature of Things, which is kind of a philosophical epic poem, which I haven't read yet, but I'm going to be reading next month. And we have Lucan, the Civil War, an epic poem that he wrote about Julius Caesar's war to basically take down the Roman Republic. And this is really interesting. It's not, again, like with Virgil, it's not as immediately entertaining as Ovid's Metamorphoses is, but it is really interesting and kind of subversive, so it is really interesting. But mostly it's interesting if you've read a lot of the other classics of Greece and Rome, so it's not a place to start with the classics of Greece and Rome. And then, as a kind of actually a borderline obscure work, this is the Thebaid by Statius. Statius, if you've read Dante's Divine Comedy, you may recognize the name of Statius, because he actually appears in Purgatory. He actually leads Dante and Virgil through a part of Purgatory, because Dante regarded Statius as a Christian who somehow had Christian values, and read this work as a sort of Christian allegory of some sort. I don't know about that, but this is about the Seven Against Thebes, the sort of civil war in Thebes that blew up in the wake of the death of King Oedipus, the death of King Oedipus. And I won't say that it's a lost classic that you should all go seek out, but if you sort of exhausted a lot of the other avenues in classical literature and you want something new, this might be interesting to you. Now some lyric poets from ancient Rome. So the first thing I have here is an anthology. This is Latin Poetry in Verse Translation, edited by L.R. Lind. This is a cool anthology because it has translations from many different translators in it. So you'll find classic translations by like Christopher Marlowe of like Ovid or something. But you also have translations by A.E. Housman. Who else is in here? Robert Fitzgerald is in here, and then some other translators as well. And I think that that's a great way to anthologize the Latin poets, because it means that you're not beholden to only one translator. If one translator doesn't do it for you, then you can just switch to another. And so that's why I like this translation, and I have had a lot of success reading from this translation. And then I have some individual volumes by individual poets. This is the Odes of Horus, translated by David Slavitt, and this is the Odes and Epodes, translated by Joseph Clancy. And I've read this, and part of this, I think, and I've read another translation of Horace before that wasn't particularly good, and neither of these are really all that good. And so I'm starting to think that Horace might just be kind of inaccessible to me, because it may just not be possible to translate him into English poetry that sounds like it's at all good. So yeah, unfortunately, even though he's like one of the titans of Latin poetry, like a must-read, certainly, it's hard for me to recommend him to monoglot English readers as I am. But I can't say the same for the next two poets. So this is the poems of Catullus, who is a love poet, and I think who is my favorite lyric poet of the ancient world. I just love him. He writes love poems, but they often, like with Pindar, they often blow out into more profound themes, and yeah, I love him. I like this translation too, which is by Peter Wigham. And finally, the last Latin lyric poet, this is Propertius, the poems. I also really like Propertius. This has a really good and informative introduction and notes, and is a translation by Guy Lee. Another love poet, but again, there's often more subtle commentary woven into the love poems. Then we come to the heavy hitters for me. With the Romans, really, the writers from ancient Rome that I am most interested in, on the whole, are the historians. And so, yeah, that's quite nice. So, the first one I have is one who really isn't a historian, but it's Julius Caesar. So this is The War for Gaul, which is translated by James O'Donnell, and is his commentaries on the Gallic Wars. And this is The Civil War, translated by Jane Mitchell. And so yeah, this is his account of his conquest of Gaul, which is now France. This is an account which overlaps with Lucan's account of the war that he fought to destroy the Roman Republic. I've read this one. It's a good read. It's really interesting in terms of just getting insight into Julius Caesar's life and his mind. And it is a pretty good narrative. But reading Julius Caesar's, I'm always ambivalent because he's kind of a horrible person, but he writes well. So, moving on to authors I can recommend more wholeheartedly, I have here Tacitus, The Annals of Imperial Rome, which is excellent. It's all about sort of the wearing away of Roman democracy, because obviously there was the takeover by Julius Caesar and later Augustus, but that didn't permanently destroy the Republic. There were still certain democratic bastions in place, but this book tells the story of those being worn down, and Rome officially becoming, an autocracy, really. And it's a fascinating read. I need to reread it, though. And then one of my favorite books ever. This is Suetonius, The Lives of the 12 Caesars. These are basically miniature lives, sort of like Plutarch, of Julius Caesar and the 11 Caesars that came after him. And they're just hilarious. They're just awesome. It's sort of like a gossip page from the ancient world, because it has all of the sort of unsubstantiated, weird, crazy stories about the Roman emperors that you don't get in the more tame historians. And yeah, they're just great, because they're great because Suetonius talks a lot about their private lives, their eating life and their sex life and their love life and these sort of things. And I guess I have a bit of a voyeuristic interest in that sort of thing when it comes to people like the emperors of Rome. So this is a great fun read. And then alright, so two more who I have read. Livy, The War with Hannibal, a great read. I did actually a review video very recently on this. It's just so much fun to read. He really is a great storyteller. And the same goes for this next one, which is The History of Alexander by Quintus Curtius Rufus. One of the prime sources that we have on Alexander the Great, and like Livy, just a great read. Just a great read as a narrative experience. It's not something you can always take seriously as a historical source, but it's great. It's great fun to read. And then finally, we have a historian who I haven't read yet. This is Sallust. So this is the Jugurthine War and the Conspiracy of Catiline. And yeah, I haven't read this yet, but Sallust reportedly actually wrote a lot more than this, but this is all that survives, which is true of a lot of ancient writers. And then a couple of philosophers. This is a kind of a lovely edition of the Golden Sayings of Epictetus, and I really like this. It's very quotable. You can read it in like an hour, really, and yeah, it's just very quotable, a lot of wisdom in there. Same goes with the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which is one of my favorite nonfiction books. Just a great source of wisdom, I think. And I can't quite say the same for this last one. This is Letters from a Stoic by Seneca. And there are some nuggets of wisdom in this, but they're kind of buried in a rather long book that is incredibly dull. He repeats himself a lot. He goes into a lot of detail on things that are not remotely interesting. And yeah, this is just a dull read, honestly. I think if you're gonna get into Stoic philosophy, just read the Meditations because it's short. And then lastly, I thought I would talk about the two writers who are kind of the last of the writers of the ancient world. So the first is Augustine, St. Augustine. This is his Confessions. I read this translation. I haven't read this one yet. This is by Peter Constantine. This is translated by Edward Pusey. And yeah, so it's sort of kind of a spiritual testimony by Augustine about how he became a Catholic. And I don't really like it. It's kind of dull and boring, which may be an unpopular opinion, but anyway. And then finally we have the book that is widely considered to be the very last work of ancient Rome. This is Boethius, The Consolation of Philosophy, and I really like this book. It has some really interesting commentary on that sort of age-old question of like the problem of evil, like why would a good God allow evil to exist? And it speaks to that question. It also has actually a lot of Stoic philosophy in it as well. It's a really good read and short, and I really like it. So anyway, yeah, so that's my whole collection. This is going to be a long video, but you know, let me know if you have thoughts on any of these books, and yeah, I will see you in whatever video I post next, and in whatever video I post next in this series. So I hope you all enjoyed. Let me know what classics of Greece and Rome you've read, and whether you like the classics of Greece and Rome, whether you're interested in them, and what do you think of these books as well. So anyway, I'll let you go, guys. Bye.